The certified letter in my trembling hands contained $1 million fine and a court order to remove all livestock from my property within 72 hours. Carol Pemberton, president of Meadowbrook Estates HOA, stood on my front porch with a smug smile and 3 sheriff's deputies, watching as I read the document that she thought would destroy my family's 100-year cattle ranch. "Mr. Martinez," she said in that shrill voice that had become the soundtrack to my nightmares, "your illegal farming operation ends today. This is a residential community, not some backward agricultural wasteland." What Carol didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, as she stood there in her designer heels and pearl necklace, was that I wasn't just some stubborn rancher refusing to follow HOA rules. I was Miguel Martinez, the regional director of the Bureau of Land Management, and I controlled the grazing rights to over 2 million acres of federal land surrounding her precious subdivision. But let me back up 2 years, because this story starts with something much smaller: a fence. My name is Miguel Martinez, and I'm the 4th generation to work the Esperanza Ranch, 800 acres of prime grazing land in what used to be rural New Mexico. My great-grandfather had established the spread in 1924, building it from nothing into one of the most respected cattle operations in the state. For 90 years, the Martinez family had run cattle on our private land and the surrounding federal grazing allotments without a single complaint. We were good neighbors, responsible land stewards, and proud members of a community that understood the importance of agriculture to the local economy. That all changed when Meadowbrook Estates started construction on the adjacent hillside. The development was supposed to be a small community of maybe 20 houses, marketed to retirees who wanted to enjoy the authentic Western lifestyle while living in suburban comfort. The marketing brochures showed happy couples horseback riding through scenic landscapes, with captions about living in harmony with nature and embracing the ranching tradition. What actually got built was a 100-house subdivision of McMansions, complete with manicured lawns, decorative desert landscaping, and residents who had moved from places like Phoenix and Albuquerque, with very different ideas about what constituted appropriate land use. Carol Pemberton was one of the first to move in, purchasing the largest house in the development and immediately appointing herself as the unofficial spokesperson for the community's quality of life concerns. The first sign of trouble came when Carol complained to the county about my boundary fence. The fence had been there for 40 years, marking the line between my grazing pasture and what was then empty desert. It was sturdy, functional, and perfectly legal. But according to Carol, my fence was aesthetically incompatible with the neighborhood's upscale image. I got a call from county planner Sandra Rodriguez, who sounded embarrassed as she explained the complaint. "Miguel," she said, "I know this is ridiculous, but we received a formal complaint about your fence not meeting residential subdivision standards. Obviously, your ranch predates their development by decades, but they're demanding that we investigate." "Let me guess," I replied. Carol Pemberton filed the complaint. "How did you know?" "Because she's been driving by my property every day for the past month, taking pictures and making notes. I figured it was only a matter of time before she tried something." Sandra assured me that my fence was grandfathered in and completely legal, but Carol wasn't satisfied with the county's response. Within a week, she had organized the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association and filed a lawsuit claiming that my ranch constituted a nuisance that was damaging property values in her subdivision. The lawsuit was frivolous, but it was also expensive to defend. Carol had hired Patterson and Associates, one of Albuquerque's most aggressive law firms, and they were demanding everything from environmental impact studies to traffic analyses to prove that my cattle operation wasn't harming the neighborhood. My lawyer, an old family friend named Tom Chavez, was confident we would win, but he warned me that Carol seemed determined to make the process as costly and time-consuming as possible. "Miguel," he said during one of our strategy meetings, "I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone this committed to destroying a neighbor's livelihood. She's spending more money on legal fees than most people make in a year, just to harass you." Tom was right. Over the next 6 months, Carol filed 17 separate legal challenges against my ranch. She claimed my cattle were contaminating groundwater, even though my wells tested cleaner than the municipal water supply. She argued that dust from my dirt roads was a health hazard, despite the fact that her own subdivision generated 10 times more dust during construction. Most absurdly, she sued me for visual pollution, claiming that the sight of cattle grazing in their natural habitat was psychologically damaging to her neighbors and lowering their quality of life. Every lawsuit was ultimately dismissed, but each one cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees and weeks of lost time dealing with inspectors, environmental consultants, and court appearances. The harassment campaign escalated when Carol discovered that I worked for the Bureau of Land Management. Instead of recognizing that this meant I understood land use regulations better than most people, she decided it meant I was part of some vast government conspiracy against private property owners. She started attending county commission meetings, demanding investigations into my conflict of interest as both a BLM employee and a rancher. She filed complaints with the Office of Inspector General, claiming that I was using my government position to give myself preferential treatment in grazing permit renewals. None of her accusations had any merit, but they triggered formal investigations that required me to take time off work to provide documents and testimony. My supervisors were supportive, but the constant distractions were affecting my job performance and putting my career at risk. The most infuriating part was that Carol had no understanding of how grazing permits actually worked. She seemed to think that I had somehow given myself special privileges, when in reality my family's grazing rights had been established decades before I was even born, and they were renewed based on strict environmental and economic criteria that had nothing to do with my employment. But Carol's biggest mistake was underestimating just how much authority I actually had in my position as regional director. As the BLM's senior official for a region covering 12 million acres across 3 states, I was responsible for managing grazing permits, mining leases, recreational access, and environmental protection on vast stretches of federal land. The authority came with enormous responsibility, but it also came with the power to make decisions that affected entire communities. And Carol Pemberton was about to learn exactly what that meant. The turning point came when Carol managed to get the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, officially incorporated and began using it as a weapon against my ranch. The new association's bylaws claimed authority over all properties within the Meadowbrook Estates community area, which according to their extremely creative interpretation, included my ranch. The legal theory was nonsensical, but Carol had found a judge who was sympathetic to her claims about incompatible land use in residential areas. Judge Harrison Fletcher was known for his hostility toward agricultural operations, and he seemed receptive to Carol's arguments about the need to modernize land use in developing communities. That's when I received the certified letter with the $1 million fine and the 72-hour ultimatum to remove my cattle. The fine was based on Carol's calculation of the property value damage my ranch had supposedly caused to Meadowbrook Estates. She claimed that the presence of cattle had reduced home values by an average of $20,000 per house, multiplied by 50 houses, plus punitive damages for willful violation of community standards. The court order was even more outrageous. Judge Fletcher had granted a temporary restraining order requiring me to remove all livestock from my property, pending a full hearing on the HOA's claims. Failure to comply would result in contempt of court charges and daily fines of $10,000. As I stood on my porch, reading the documents while Carol watched with obvious satisfaction, I realized that she had finally pushed too far. She wasn't just harassing me anymore. She was threatening the foundation of my family's legacy and my livelihood. But what Carol didn't understand was that she had just declared war on someone who controlled the resources her entire community depended on. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and a stack of federal land management maps, plotting the most comprehensive and devastating response to HOA tyranny in the history of the American West. The first thing I did was review the grazing permits for all federal land in the area surrounding Meadowbrook Estates. What I found was fascinating. Carroll's subdivision had been built on private land that was completely surrounded by federal grazing allotments controlled by my office. The developer had obtained access to the subdivision through a series of easements and right-of-way agreements that crossed federal land. These agreements were renewable annually and subject to environmental review based on changing conditions and land use priorities. More importantly, the water rights that supplied Meadowbrook Estates came from wells that were located on federal land under BLM jurisdiction. The subdivision's developer had negotiated a water access agreement that was also subject to annual renewal and could be modified if land use changes affected environmental conditions. Carroll had built her attack on my ranch around the premise that agricultural use was incompatible with residential development. She was about to learn that residential development could be just as incompatible with agricultural use. The second part of my plan involved the recreational access agreements that allowed Meadowbrook Estates residents to use federal hiking trails and camping areas that surrounded their community. These agreements were part of what made the subdivision attractive to buyers who wanted to enjoy outdoor activities without having to drive long distances to reach public land. As regional director, I had the authority to modify these agreements if environmental concerns or land use conflicts arose. Carroll's documented harassment of agricultural operations could certainly be classified as a land use conflict that threatened the BLM's mandate to balance multiple uses of federal resources. The third element was the most devastating. Carroll's subdivision depended on a private road that crossed federal land to connect to the county highway system. The road easement was granted under terms that required the developer to maintain harmonious relationships with existing land users and to avoid activities that could disrupt traditional agricultural operations. Carroll's legal campaign against my ranch was a clear violation of these easement conditions. As regional director, I had not only the authority but the responsibility to take action when easement holders violated their agreements. But the masterstroke of my plan was something Carroll had never considered: the environmental impact of her own subdivision. Federal environmental regulations required periodic review of all activities that might affect land or water resources on public land. As regional director, I could initiate a comprehensive environmental assessment of how Meadowbrook Estates was affecting the surrounding federal grazing areas. Such an assessment would examine everything from groundwater usage to soil erosion to wildlife habitat disruption. Given that the subdivision had been built in a previously undeveloped area with no environmental impact study, there was a good chance that the review would reveal serious violations of federal environmental law. I spent the weekend preparing my counterattack, gathering documentation and legal precedents that would turn Carroll's HOA into the target instead of the weapon. By Monday morning, I was ready to show Carroll Pemberton what real authority looked like. The first shot across the bow came Tuesday morning when Carroll received a certified letter from the Bureau of Land Management, notifying her that the water access agreement for Meadowbrook Estates was under review due to land use conflicts affecting federal resources. The letter explained that my office had received complaints about harassment of traditional agricultural operations, which violated the terms of the subdivision's environmental agreements. The review would determine whether modifications to the water access agreement were necessary to protect federal interests. Carroll called my office within an hour, demanding to speak with me about the outrageous government overreach that was threatening her community's water supply. My secretary, Maria Santos, handled the call with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said, "Director Martinez is available to discuss your concerns, but all communications regarding ongoing regulatory matters must be in writing and submitted through proper channels." "This is harassment," Carol screamed into the phone. "He can't punish an entire community because of a personal dispute." "Ma'am," Maria replied calmly, "the Bureau of Land Management is required to investigate any violations of federal land use agreements. If you have concerns about the review process, you're welcome to file a formal appeal through the appropriate administrative procedures." The second blow came Wednesday when the Meadowbrook Estates HOA received notice that their recreational access agreements were being suspended pending a comprehensive review of compliance with federal regulations. Suddenly, residents of the subdivision couldn't access the hiking trails, camping areas, and scenic viewpoints that had been major selling points for their expensive homes. The community bulletin board was flooded with angry messages from homeowners who had paid premium prices specifically for access to federal recreation areas. Carol tried to organize a community meeting to address the crisis, but she was facing a room full of neighbors who were beginning to understand that her personal war against my ranch was costing them the amenities they had paid for. Margaret Foster, who lived in one of the smaller houses near the entrance to the subdivision, stood up during the meeting and addressed Carol directly. "I moved here specifically for the hiking trails and the rural atmosphere," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Now you're telling me that we can't use the trails because you decided to sue our neighbor over his cattle? I paid $50,000 more for this house than I would have paid in town, and now I'm getting less than I would have gotten in town." Other residents quickly joined in with similar complaints. Jim Patterson, a retiree from Phoenix, pointed out that his property value had probably decreased by more than Carol's fictitious cattle damages, just from the loss of recreational access. "Carol," he said, "you keep talking about property values, but your lawsuit has cost us more in lost amenities than Miguel's cows ever cost us in anything." By Thursday, Carol was facing a revolt from her own community. The HOA board called an emergency meeting to discuss whether they should drop the lawsuit against my ranch in order to restore access to federal recreation areas. Carol fought desperately to maintain control, arguing that giving in to government intimidation would set a dangerous precedent for property rights. But her neighbors were more concerned about their immediate loss of recreational access and the potential impact on their property values. The board voted 4-1 to authorize settlement negotiations with my ranch, with only Carol dissenting. But I wasn't finished with Carol Pemberton yet. Friday morning brought the most devastating blow of all, a notice that the road easement serving Meadowbrook Estates was under review for violations of federal land use agreements. The letter explained that harassment of traditional agricultural operations violated the harmonious relationship clause of the easement agreement, and that continued violations could result in suspension or termination of the road access. Without the road easement, Meadowbrook Estates would be completely cut off from the county highway system. The subdivision would become inaccessible to emergency services, mail delivery, and utility maintenance. The 100 expensive houses would become worthless overnight. The panic in Meadowbrook Estates was immediate and intense. Property owners started calling real estate agents to discuss emergency sales. The homeowner's insurance company sent a representative to assess whether they could cancel policies for properties with uncertain access rights. Carol received dozens of angry phone calls from neighbors threatening lawsuits if her personal vendetta cost them their homes and their investments. The final blow came the following Monday, when federal environmental investigators arrived to begin the comprehensive assessment of Meadowbrook Estates' impact on surrounding federal lands. The investigation team included specialists in water resources, soil conservation, wildlife biology, and air quality. They set up monitoring equipment throughout the subdivision and began collecting samples from water sources, soil profiles, and air quality stations. The investigators also interviewed neighboring land users, including me, about how the subdivision's development had affected traditional agricultural operations and natural resource management. I was completely honest in my testimony, explaining how construction dust, increased traffic, and urban runoff had affected my cattle operation and the surrounding grazing areas. I provided documentation showing increased costs for veterinary care due to respiratory problems in my herd, and data demonstrating reduced forage quality in pastures downwind from the construction sites. The environmental assessment was thorough, professional, and devastating to Carol's position. The investigation revealed that Meadowbrook Estates had been built without proper environmental impact studies, had violated federal clean water regulations, and had disrupted wildlife migration patterns in the area. Most damning of all, the assessment found that Carol's harassment campaign against my ranch had interfered with traditional land use patterns that were essential to maintaining the ecological balance of the federal grazing areas. The final environmental report recommended that Meadowbrook Estates be required to implement expensive remediation measures, including installation of advanced water treatment systems, construction of wildlife corridors, and establishment of buffer zones to protect adjacent agricultural operations. The estimated cost of compliance was over $2 million, which would have to be paid by the homeowners through special assessments on their properties. By this point, Carol was facing not just a revolt from her neighbors, but potential lawsuits from every homeowner in the subdivision. Her legal campaign against my ranch had backfired spectacularly, creating environmental liabilities and access problems that threatened the very existence of her community. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA board called an emergency meeting to address the crisis. This time, Carol wasn't even invited to attend. The board voted unanimously to fire Carol as president, dissolve the lawsuit against my ranch, and authorize a public apology for the harassment campaign. They also voted to offer compensation for my legal expenses and to establish a community fund for environmental remediation efforts. But the most satisfying moment came when the board asked me to attend their next meeting as an honored guest, to discuss how Meadowbrook Estates could become a better neighbor to the agricultural community. Standing in the community center that Carol had used as her command post for the war against my ranch, I addressed a room full of residents who were eager to repair the relationship their former HOA president had tried to destroy. "I want to be clear," I told them, "that I never wanted this conflict. My family has been ranching this land for 4 generations, and we've always believed that good neighbors work together to solve problems instead of creating them." The response was immediate and positive. Several residents approached me after the meeting to apologize personally for Carol's actions and to express their appreciation for the agricultural heritage of the area. Margaret Foster, who had spoken out against Carol at the previous meeting, shook my hand and said, "I moved here because I wanted to experience the authentic Western lifestyle. I just didn't understand that meant respecting the people who actually live that lifestyle." Within a month, the new HOA board had worked out agreements that benefited both communities. Meadowbrook Estates residents could visit my ranch for educational tours about ranching and land stewardship. In return, I agreed to provide consultation on landscaping with native plants and water conservation techniques that would reduce the subdivision's environmental impact. The road easement and recreational access agreements were restored once the HOA demonstrated good faith efforts to comply with environmental regulations and maintain positive relationships with neighboring land users. But what happened to Carol Pemberton was the most satisfying part of the whole story. The legal bills from her failed campaign against my ranch, combined with the environmental remediation costs and the loss of property value from the access restrictions, had bankrupted her financially. She was forced to sell her house at a significant loss and move back to Phoenix. The sale took 8 months because potential buyers were concerned about the ongoing environmental issues and the uncertain access situation that Carol's actions had created. When the house finally sold, it was for 30% less than Carol had paid for it. The new owners turned out to be a young couple from Las Cruces, who specifically wanted to live in a rural area where they could experience traditional agricultural life. They introduced themselves by bringing me a homemade pie and asking if they could buy beef directly from my ranch. 6 months after Carol's departure, I received an unexpected visitor at my ranch. Judge Harrison Fletcher, the same judge who had granted the original restraining order against my cattle, showed up at my door with an apologetic expression and a bottle of good whiskey. "Mr. Martinez," he said, "I owe you an apology. I let my prejudices against agricultural operations cloud my judgment in that case. After seeing how the environmental investigation played out, I realized that I was completely wrong about the impact of your ranch on the community." Judge Fletcher explained that he had grown up in an urban area and had never understood the complex relationships between agriculture, environmental conservation, and rural communities. Carol's legal arguments had appealed to his assumptions about land use conflicts, but the environmental assessment had educated him about the positive role that responsible ranching played in maintaining healthy ecosystems. "I've learned more about land management in the past 6 months than I learned in 20 years on the bench," he admitted. "Your operation is actually protecting the environment, not harming it." The judge's change of heart led to a broader shift in how land use conflicts were handled in our district. Fletcher began requiring environmental impact assessments for all development projects near agricultural operations, and he established new precedents for protecting traditional land use rights from frivolous HOA lawsuits. 3 years later, the Esperanza Ranch was stronger than ever. The publicity from Carol's failed lawsuit had actually brought positive attention to our operation, and we were now selling premium beef directly to restaurants throughout New Mexico and Arizona. The partnership with Meadowbrook Estates had evolved into a model for how residential development and agriculture could coexist beneficially. The subdivision's residents had become some of our best customers for organic beef, and several families had started their own small-scale agricultural projects with guidance from my ranch. Most importantly, my position with the Bureau of Land Management had been strengthened by the professional way I had handled Carol's harassment campaign. Instead of using my authority for personal revenge, I had used it to enforce legitimate environmental and land use regulations that protected federal resources while resolving a community conflict. But the ripple effects of Carol's failed campaign went far beyond our little corner of New Mexico. Word of the case had spread throughout the federal land management community, and I started getting calls from BLM offices across the West, asking for advice on similar situations. The most significant call came from Regional Director Patricia Williams in Colorado, who was dealing with a subdivision that had been built adjacent to federal grazing land and was now trying to eliminate all cattle operations in the area. "Miguel," she said during our phone conversation, "we've got a situation up here that sounds exactly like what you dealt with. A development called Alpine Meadows is claiming that cattle grazing on federal land is damaging their property values and creating health hazards." Patricia explained that the Alpine Meadows HOA was using tactics that were almost identical to Carol's playbook: frivolous lawsuits, environmental complaints, and harassment of ranching families who had been using the federal grazing allotments for generations. "The difference is," Patricia continued, "this development is much larger than your Meadowbrook Estate situation. We're talking about 500 houses and a golf course, and they've hired a team of lawyers from Denver who specialize in land use litigation." I spent 2 days in Colorado, touring the Alpine Meadows area and meeting with the affected ranchers. The situation was indeed more complex than what I had faced with Carol, but the fundamental issues were the same: wealthy suburbanites who had moved to a rural area and then decided that rural activities were incompatible with their lifestyle. The solution I recommended was based on the same principles I had used in New Mexico: enforce existing federal regulations consistently and professionally, while educating all parties about the multiple-use mandate that governed federal land management. Within 6 months, the Alpine Meadows case was resolved using the legal precedents and administrative procedures that had been developed during my conflict with Carol. The HOA's lawsuit was dismissed. The ranchers kept their grazing permits, and the development was required to implement environmental mitigation measures that actually improve the overall ecosystem health of the area. The success in Colorado led to similar interventions in Wyoming, Montana, and Utah, where HOA versus agriculture conflicts were becoming increasingly common as urban populations moved to rural areas. The pattern was always the same. New residents would move to rural areas attracted by the authentic Western lifestyle, but then try to eliminate the actual Western activities that created that lifestyle. My experience with Carol had taught me that the key to resolving these conflicts was education rather than confrontation. We developed a program called Living with the Land that helped new rural residents understand the history, economics, and environmental benefits of traditional agricultural practices. The program included ranch tours, educational workshops, and partnerships between agricultural operations and residential communities. The program was so successful that it was adopted by the National Association of Counties as a model for managing rural development conflicts. I was invited to speak at conferences across the country about balancing agricultural preservation with residential growth. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the transformation that had occurred in my own community. Meadowbrook Estates had gone from being a hostile neighbor to being one of the strongest supporters of agricultural preservation in the county. The subdivision's new HOA board had established a heritage preservation committee that worked to document and celebrate the agricultural history of the area. They organized annual events like ranch days, where residents could learn about cattle handling, land management, and the economics of ranching. Margaret Foster, who had spoken out against Carol during the community revolt, became the committee's chairwoman and one of my closest allies in promoting agricultural education. Miguel, she told me during one of our committee meetings, I realize now that Carol's mistake wasn't just harassing you personally. She was trying to erase the very heritage that made this place special enough for us to want to live here. The Heritage Preservation Committee had raised funds to install historical markers throughout the area, explaining the role that ranching had played in developing the region. They had also lobbied successfully for the creation of an agricultural preservation district that would protect working ranches from future development pressures. The economic impact of this partnership had been significant for both communities. Meadowbrook Estates residents, who bought beef directly from my ranch, were getting higher quality meat at lower prices than they would pay in grocery stores. My ranch was earning premium prices for direct sales, which allowed me to invest in improved pasture management and better facilities. Several residents had even invested in my operation as silent partners, providing capital for expansion in exchange for a share of the profits. This arrangement had allowed me to purchase additional grazing permits and upgrade my cattle genetics to focus on premium organic beef production. The partnership had also attracted attention from the state tourism department, which featured our agritourism collaboration in promotional materials, encouraging urban visitors to experience authentic ranch life. Weekend ranch tours had become so popular that I had to hire additional staff to handle the demand. But the most satisfying development was the change in how land use conflicts were handled throughout the region. The legal precedents established during my battle with Carol had made it much more difficult for HOAs to use frivolous lawsuits to harass agricultural operations. County commissioners had adopted new ordinances requiring HOAs to demonstrate legitimate harm before filing lawsuits against existing agricultural operations. The ordinances also established mediation procedures to resolve conflicts before they escalated to litigation. Judge Harrison Fletcher, who had initially sided with Carol's lawsuit, had become one of the strongest advocates for these new procedures. He regularly spoke at legal conferences about the importance of understanding traditional land use rights and the environmental benefits of responsible agricultural practices. The Martinez case taught me that my job as a judge isn't just to interpret the law, he told a gathering of rural judges last year. It's to understand the complex relationships between different land uses and to protect the rights of all community members, not just the ones who can afford expensive lawyers. The case had also led to changes in state law that strengthened protections for agricultural operations against HOA harassment. The Martinez Agricultural Protection Act required HOAs to prove actual damages before filing lawsuits against agricultural operations, and it established penalties for frivolous litigation designed to force farmers and ranchers off their land. The law had been adopted by 6 other states and was being considered by Congress as a model for federal legislation protecting agricultural land use rights. But the personal satisfaction I felt from these broader changes paled in comparison to the simple pleasure of watching my cattle graze peacefully in the same pastures that Carol Pemberton had tried to eliminate. The case became a model for other BLM regions, dealing with similar conflicts between development and traditional land use. I was invited to speak at conferences about balancing multiple land uses and managing conflicts between residential and agricultural communities. The most recent recognition came when I was selected to receive the National Cattlemen's Association's Defender of Agriculture Award for my work protecting grazing rights and promoting cooperation between agricultural and residential communities. The award ceremony was held in Denver, and several of my neighbors from Meadowbrook Estates made the trip to attend. Margaret Foster introduced me to the audience, explaining how my professional response to Carol's harassment transformed a hostile conflict into a model partnership. Miguel could have used his position to simply crush the people who were attacking him, she told the crowd. Instead, he used it to educate us about the value of agriculture and to build bridges between 2 very different communities. That's the kind of leadership our rural areas need. But the story that really showed how much things had changed came last month, when I received a call from a rancher named Sarah Mitchell, who lived about 100 miles south of my ranch. "Mr. Martinez," she said, "I heard about your situation with the HOA and the cattle ranch, and I was wondering if you could help me. My HOA is trying to force me to remove my horses, and I think they're using some of the same tactics that woman used against you." I smiled as I looked out at my cattle grazing peacefully in the same pastures that Carol Pemberton had tried to eliminate. "Sarah," I said, "let's talk about it. I've learned a few things about dealing with HOA overreach, and I'd be happy to share them with you. Because if there's one thing I learned from dealing with Carol Pemberton, it's this. When someone tries to use fake authority to destroy your way of life, the best response is to use real authority to protect everyone's right to live according to their values." Carol tried to use her HOA to eliminate my family's ranching operation. Instead, she helped me create stronger protections for agricultural land use and showed an entire community the value of working together instead of fighting each other. Every morning, when I feed my cattle, I'm reminded that sometimes the best revenge is just continuing to live the life that someone tried to take away from you and making sure that life is better and stronger than it was before they tried to destroy it. Trust me, the next HOA Karen who tries to eliminate a century-old ranch is going to discover that there's more than one kind of grazing right, and some of them come with federal authority attached.